I live at an apartment in downtown Concord, New Hampshire. I have no roommate. I love living by myself. I also lived at the Laconia State School and Training Center for 25 years. It's an institution in Laconia, New Hampshire. My parents admitted me because of my learning disability. I was 4 years old, just a baby. Can you imagine that? That young?
We often judge others based on how they conform to our idea of what is normal. Normal appearance, behavior, ability. And those we deem abnormal, we may consider undeserving of common respect and dignity, and even basic rights. For many with intellectual and developmental disabilities, this has meant segregation, isolation, and exclusion with little or no opportunity to access the good things in life. In the early 1970s, Wolfensberger promoted an idea that challenged our understanding of what normal is for people with intellectual disabilities and forever changed the field of human services.
The most honest definition of disability is the experience of being pushed to the bottom and edge of culture and community. Because across time and place, we just don't have examples where people with significant disabilities have been anywhere but the bottom and edge of culture and community.
You know, years ago, parents of children with what we call intellectual disabilities basically had two choices, okay? They could institutionalize their children or keep them at home without any support. Those were the only two options.
It was common for doctors to advise parents to place their children with intellectual disabilities, then referred to as mental retardation, in institutions.
The doctors said, forget about them and have your own family. Pay attention to the children that you have at home. Or as they did to me, say, have another child to replace Rob.
In the mid-1960s, institutions, euphemistically called state schools, were the default providers of services for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Over 200,000, half of them children. Steve Holmes worked at the Fernald State School in Waltham, Massachusetts, which housed 2,500 men and women.
I was 19 years old. I showed up to work. I had no orientation. I worked on a ward which is about the size of this room here. There were 28 men living in this ward. All of those men were in metal cribs. People weren't in wheelchairs. People laid in bed all day. They basically laid in diapers. I could not believe that people could live in these kind of conditions. It was unbelievable.
Muriel Grace's son Rob was a resident at the Rideau Regional Center in Smith Falls, Ontario.
Rob was at Rideau Regional for 13 months. He fell and broke his 2 front teeth, had a broken nose, abused.
It's very apparent that the people who were working with those people, or who had the responsibility for caring for those people, didn't see them as human beings, okay? Because if they had seen them as human beings, they wouldn't have treated them that way.
Parents whose children with disabilities were in institutions or kept at home with no services became angry and started to organize.
The parent movement, okay, that really didn't start at all until 1950, and it really wasn't until the 1960s. And it became known that President Kennedy, JFK, had a sister with mental retardation, and Eunice Shriver was very vocal in talking about that. That made it easy for parents who had been stigmatized themselves to come out and to admit they had a child with mental retardation and to say, we're not going to accept traditional practices. We're not going to accept warehousing.
Advocacy organizations like the Association for Retarded Children, now called the ARC, worked with parents to try to improve conditions at the institutions, but it was an uphill battle.
It was a dirty little secret of professionals and researchers. They kind of knew that the conditions were bad, but they didn't do anything about it. They accepted it.
Burton Blatt, a professor of special education at Syracuse University, was one of the first professionals to speak out about the horrors of institutions.
He went surreptitiously into institutions with a photographer who would open up his coat and take pictures with a small camera mounted on his belt, and did the photo essay Christmas in Purgatory. Horrible gay decorations for Christmas and people in restraints and naked and feces on the floor. And nobody would publish his book, and so he ended up self-publishing it and sent a copy to every member of Congress.
Blatt's forceful writings and presentations gave strength to a growing movement in the parent advocacy community, deinstitutionalization. This social movement called for the closure of institutions with people moving into their communities. One of Blatt's actions was to create a university-based policy, research, and advocacy organization dedicated to promoting the rights of people with intellectual disabilities.
This was his effort to develop, in a sense, a center, a place in a university that could study those issues and bring about change and begin the revolution of eliminating institutional life for people with developmental disabilities.
At this time, Wolfensberger, a young academic trained as a clinical psychologist, was working in Nebraska. After witnessing the destruction of war as a child, he left Germany in 1950 and studied in the United States, earning a doctorate at Peabody College. In Nebraska, Wolfensberger helped to move people with intellectual disabilities from the large public institution, Beatrice, into the community.
And at that time, Nebraska was really at the vanguard of moving people from large facilities into more normal living and work environments.
Beatrice was representative of its time, a large facility housing over 2,000 people in overcrowded, dehumanizing conditions.
The severely retarded spend only their sleeping hours in the dormitories. Their waking ones are spent sitting in the corridors or outdoors. Some are shut. There are 6 dormitories in the building, and the overcrowding is extreme.
KETV in Nebraska produced a news series on the conditions at Beatrice titled Out of the Darkness. As with Blatt's expose, Christmas in Purgatory, this program showed the deplorable conditions in institutions and the need for community supports.
One often finds that personnel suffer, really, if one can use this word, from views either that the resident, the retarded person at Beatrice is not quite human. In that case, you can view them as animals, and you keep them as animals physically. And until the attitudes change, and until the attitudes in a good part of the staff of Beatrice change, all the money in the world is not going to make a good institution out of Beatrice.
At Nebraska, he had published something like 70 articles, but he came to the conclusion that it wasn't going to be his academic research articles that were going to change the world.
In 1969, Wolfensberger became editor of Changing Patterns in Residential Services, a collection of essays by 14 leaders in the field of intellectual disabilities from the United States, the United Kingdom, Sweden, and Denmark. The principle of normalization, a concept developed in Scandinavia, became its cornerstone and Wolfensberger's inspiration for an idea that would change human services.
There would be an overarching, guiding principle or an idea, and it suddenly hit us, principle of normalization. It is high level, it applies to all services, it applies to all sorts of needy people and impaired people and societally devalued people, and so we made that the centerpiece of the book.
Because of his work in Nebraska and his travel abroad, Wolfensberger was well connected to current and emerging ideas.
I learned about the principle of normalization through my contact with three leading Scandinavian figures. One was Niels Erik Bank Mikkelsen, the other one was Bengt Nierje, and the third was Carl Grunewald.
Niels Erik Bank Mikkelsen visited the Sonoma State Hospital, a large institution, in November of 1967. He told a reporter that, in our country, we would not be allowed to treat cattle like that. Both Bank Mikkelsen and Bengt Nierje visited the United States and spoke of the much better living conditions provided to people with intellectual disabilities in Scandinavia.
It was Bengt Nierje who came up with the phrase, the normalization principle. He was the first one who spelled it out.
There was no normal rhythm of day. There was no normal rhythm of week in the institution. They were abnormal. And I wanted as normal life conditions as possible.
This idea, not of making people normal, but of taking steps with people that, were culturally normative. So not warehousing them, that's not culturally normative. Community living, rights.
The range of choices about lifestyle and living situation and relationships that all of us have.
With the publication and wide distribution of changing patterns, Wolfensberger helped to change the conversation from institutional reform to rethinking our assumptions of disability and the role of human services.
And you can say that this is the book that broke the back of the institutional service system.
Changing patterns just meant that there really was something else that could be done. Things have to change, these places have to be closed, and parents and families have to be supported.
In 1971, Wolfensberger was invited to work as a visiting scholar at the National Institute on Mental Retardation in Toronto. He expanded Nierje's principle of normalization and spoke widely and forcefully across Canada.
He came to Canada, turned the country upside down within 2 years. Quite remarkable. Made lots of enemies, lots of friends. He was a polarizing figure, which was really needed at the time. If the institutional model was to be dealt a death blow, timidity was not going to do the job, and Wolf was certainly not timid.
Wolfensberger submitted a number of articles on his version of normalization to Mental Deficiency, a leading academic journal of the time. His articles were not published, the editor saying his ideas were not new.
That made me so mad, I decided that I would bypass the journal culture and just write a book about it.
In 1972, the Canadian National Institute on Mental Retardation published The Principle of Normalization in Human Services. It became a Canadian non-fiction bestseller and made Wolfensberger a celebrity within the field of intellectual disabilities.
It just swept through our field. It became one of those enlightening moments for everybody who read it.
Normalization was a sea change. It was a sea change in the way we thought about people with intellectual disabilities. It was a change in the way we thought about supporting people. It sort of challenged the fundamental notions we had.
It's not just a form of analysis. It was a call to work towards a different ideal, a different set of possibilities on behalf of people.
Wolfensberger's normalization principles spread quickly across North America, parts of Europe, and throughout Australia.
His effect was on parents in the first place, for whom suddenly there were higher expectations, there were things that they could do.
Wolf gave words to the things that my husband and I instinctively knew and understood. He labeled it, he described it, and he explained why what we felt was true.
In 1972, Bob Goodfellow and fellow graduate students from Syracuse University traveled to Toronto to hear Wolfensberger speak.
A group of us talked so excitedly about Wolf and his notions and his ideas about normalization that we pushed Burton Blatt to think about bringing Wolf here to Syracuse.
Burton Blatt, who wrote Christmas in Purgatory and started the Center on Human Policy, recruited Wolfensberger to teach at Syracuse in 1973, a time of social change and activism in the disability community. Those who worked at the Center on Human Policy viewed deinstitutionalization as the next civil rights movement. Wolfensberger packed the lecture hall with students drawn not only to what he said, but also how he said it.
He was fire and brimstone. He would stand there on the podium, he would turn beet red, he'd be pounding a theory home, and his eyes would literally roll in the back of his head, and you'd be sitting there going.
There was something about the way he looked at the students or the audience in a workshop. It just, it just got you right in the heart.
Wolf was a very difficult professor. He was impossible to please.
The overpowering first impression was, oh my gosh, that man is so annoying, and at the same time, I've never met anyone wiser.
I think Wolf was the first multimedia artist or impresario I ever encountered.
He would set up these workshops with 3 overhead projectors, and he had an artist on staff to create artwork for overhead transparencies that had to be individually burned on a thermofax machine, and would make layovers to add points the way you would build in PowerPoint now, and they would be hand-colored and they'd all be coded.
One of my fondest memories really is going to work with Dad. One of my jobs would be to come in and color portions of the overheads. Then there might be arrows or, a little cartoon, and so we would color it.
We made the transparencies, we collated, we did mailings, we knew how to fix copiers and change toner when we were 10.
The overhead projector was a totem. It was a representation of one of the things that he was known for.
Somebody made an overhead to help people pronounce his name. So they had on it Wolf and a little picture of a wolf, N's, and they had hens, burger, and they had a hamburger with an overhead in one hand and a screen in the other running,
One overhead projector might have the outline for the whole day that we'd refer back to remind people where we are, and then the middle overhead would have what we're currently talking about, and the third overhead would be sort of an intermediary, so it's a sub-step on the outline, and you'd go back and forth between the 3 overheads.
Every point is in there for some reason that may become apparent later on.
And he was, by the way, also tape recording everything. He was a very high-tech guy for 1972.
But his theatrics had a heartfelt purpose. Through his rich and highly detailed presentations, Wolfensberger made his information accessible in a way not possible through academic writing alone. He provided a framework that gave people a way to talk specifically and concretely about normalization.
Wolf's ideas put meat on the bones. He talked specifically about how people should be integrated into the community, become part of community.
Where do people spend their time during the day? And does that make a difference in terms of their lives and in the community perception of people? If people are only in the institution all day long and they never get out into the community, then their principal relationships are with other people with disabilities. They're not experiencing the broader community and all of the opportunity and the learning and the richness that provides to not only them, but to all of us.
It wasn't about being a care provider. It was about walking with that person and being a part of their life and letting them grow and experience community.
There were champions in virtually every state. People who got it early, who understood inherently that people with intellectual disabilities simply should not be treated as subhuman.
As a young professor in Ottawa, Bob Flynn used the just-released Normalization book in his new teaching position at Algonquin College.
We went through the book, the students loved it. They went to the institution for their field placement with Normalization tucked under their arms, and they would start challenging the staff and the administrators and the team leaders and so on at the institution because they were saying that, well, what you're training us for and what you're exposing us to is utterly opposed to this new book by Wolfensberger on normalization. Instead of sort of meeting the challenge, the institutional people really got quite irritated, and in fact, I've been told that they tried to get me fired.
Wolfensberger expanded the principle of normalization, giving it context, historical perspective, and empirical backing.
Almost immediately, I began to systematize and sociologize and scientificate the idea, and I broadened it from emphasis on mentally retarded people to people who are devalued in society, and it could be not just for reasons of impairment, but for other reasons as well.
Wolfensberger showed that efforts to improve conditions would be fruitless without awareness of how historical role perceptions influence our attitudes and behavior. Seeing and treating people as sick, subhuman, a menace, an object of dread, an object of pity, a burden of charity, an object of ridicule, an eternal child, or a wholly innocent leads to further devaluation.
When he described those myths, it just rang true and helped me understand that over the ages, people had labeled people in these negative contexts for good or bad, but no matter what those myths were, what the labels were, it was other, not like me, not human.
A lot of the efforts to raise funds on behalf of societally devalued people seize upon those pity and charity images, which is successful in raising funds, but it continues to emphasize the negative stereotypes that people have had for maybe thousands of years.
People who have disabilities sometimes don't immediately remind us of ourselves. There's something there that we focus in on. Some of the messages that we've been given throughout our childhoods at our kitchen table about who people are and who people aren't, some of the messages we get from the media, and then we crank the magnifying glass up and amplify that. Once you see that, then it's pretty hard to see the person.
Recalling Niels Erik Bank Mikkelson's comment that we in the U.S. treat people with intellectual disabilities worse than Denmark treats its cattle, Wolfensberger had his early students test a similar metaphor.
One of the things that we worked on was to call around to zoos and ask how much they would spend on a 120-pound monkey. The zoos, everything was more money and more care and more space than people were getting at the worst places in the U.S.
These are human beings. They should be treated like human beings. They should live like human beings. They should go through their life as human beings do. That was a new idea.
Wolfensberger believed that teaching and applying the principle of normalization could begin to break down the stereotypes that lead to the devaluation of so-called abnormal people.
Having people have the ordinary conditions of life and live in ordinary environments and have the typical routines to their lives. One, that made a difference in their life, okay? But it also made a profound difference in how other people saw them. And because it affected how other people saw them, it then affected how other people treated them.
If we deliver services in valued ways, in inclusive ways, in ways that promote the individuality of people, that show that people have gifts and talents, and we do it in the same places where everybody else is, over time, the similarities will be the things that people relate to, and the images that have been promoted historically, which were more devaluing and negative, will begin to fade into the past.
In order to reveal how people with disabilities were currently seen in our society, Wolfensberger collected historical imagery from a number of areas: art, religion, architecture, medicine, law, that demonstrated how stereotypes had been propagated over the years.
In 1848, Hervey Bacchus Wilbur started the first residential school for retarded children in North America in his own home. Now, Wilbur had started in a culturally normative family home, but this is what it became, the oldest mental retardation institution in North America that's occupied the same site.
I was really taken aback by his ability to connect what we would see as disparate or even separate phenomena, and he could see connections between them.
You'd have this big picture from the Middle Ages with all these people, and you would have, the handicapped person or the just, or, pictured in the painting, were often juxtaposed to an animal, a dog. The context was they were juxtaposed with an animal because they were animals. I mean, how did he ever come up with that?
And he would see it everywhere. So I pointed out one time that there was a high-rise for the elderly, which he dearly hated, senior housing, a nursing home, that was on a dead-end street, an early child intervention program in sight of a cemetery. And so that was the kind of parody that he loved.
Lots of photographs of graveyards next to institutions. And if it was once, you'd say it was an accident, but it was never once. It was a collection, and it was here, it was there, it was everywhere. Very sobering.
He helped people feel it at the same time as they got it intellectually.
His emotionally charged presentations weren't just academic.
The power of it was that relatively small changes could make a really big difference because they jolted people out of their way of seeing, and therefore they reacted and did things differently.
Once you understand that we make people deviant to make ourselves more comfortable, then there's lots of routes to what the good action should be.
Once you've sort of imbibed that idea, that things should be age appropriate, that they should be appropriate to your community, etc., it's impossible to look at an institution and say that's normal. It's impossible to go into a large residential setting of adults with intellectual disabilities and see bunny rabbits on the walls and think that that's appropriate.
I'll never forget listening to him one time, and he was talking about what is it that makes an institution an institution. It's as simple as, is there a water tower? Because he says, if there is a water tower associated with a facility, then that suggests that that facility is self-contained. And in a self-contained environment, people do not grow and develop.
As the one place designed to provide services to people with intellectual disabilities, the institution embodied the ideology of separateness, that people are better with their own kind and do not have a place in society with normal people.
And this notion of with their own kindism is a very strong, powerful idea. You put a little bit of therapeutic dust on that, and really well-intentioned, good people are able to believe in that for a really long time.
There were also people who were more in the caretaking mode. So the bunnies on the wall were sort of a symbol of their sense of these were special people, they're really children, they're not adults, they love the bunnies. So it was also threatening to people who had not yet thought of people with disabilities as fully adults.
Believe it or not, there was resistance from families and parents. Why? Because of fear. I mean, they knew what they were dealing with. They knew the institution. They felt they were safe, although it really wasn't true. Institutions are very unsafe places.
Parents, I think, in some ways, were invested in the idea and had been taught to be invested in the idea that their children were very different. It was pretty hard sledding in Savannah, Georgia, and probably in the American South in general, to try to have these ideas take root. In many communities, they've never taken root.
There was union backlash as well. Those providing supports to people with intellectual disabilities in the community, often in group home settings, worked at lower wages than those who worked in the institutions. Many, including institution superintendents, saw community integration as a direct threat to their jobs.
Public employee unions at the institutions were running PR campaigns saying deinstitutionalization is a cruel excuse for states to cut funding for the most needy citizens. There was a backlash against deinstitutionalization, normalization. Group homes were being started. They were firebombed in Staten Island.
Although it would meet with resistance, Wolfensberger's normalization provided a blueprint for moving forward. Those who took the lead in developing community services often had to convince the public and parents that this was indeed the right approach.
What we would do is we would open a community residence, move a group of people in, and then bring parents there to see it and say, this is the kind of life your son or daughter can have. It was a slow, difficult process, but we prevailed.
Gradually, I think people began to catch the idea of trying to do things with people and for people in ways that were normative, that matched the way that everything else happened for everybody else.
During the 1970s, the population of public institutions in the United States declined rapidly as more than 45,000 children and youth and 13,000 adults returned to their home communities. Michael Kennedy lived in 3 different institutions in New York State before moving into the community of Syracuse. First, into an intermediate care facility, basically a small community-based institution, and eventually into his own apartment, where he receives supports with housekeeping and personal cares.
You're gonna run up against some roadblocks, because you're gonna probably have a system that will tell you that, it takes a lot of work to live on your own. But you know what the biggest barrier is attitudinal. I mean, there's tons of barriers out there, but attitudinal barriers are the biggest, I think.
Group homes and other community residences were a vast improvement over the crowded institutions, but many failed to provide what we would consider a normal lifestyle.
Sometimes, in certain circumstances, you don't have the optimal choice before you, right? So you have to have certain criteria upon which you can decide for the least worst choice, which is one of his favorite sayings. You can't always have the best one, so you choose the least worst one.
Group homes became the popular least worst choice as deinstitutionalization gained momentum. Some homes were typical of their communities, serving just 2 or 3 individuals. Others, against Wolfensberger's teaching, housed 12 or more people. Wolfensberger and others warned that great care would need to be taken to ensure that group homes were fundamentally different from institutions, not just smaller.
Group homes grew out of institutions, and what we brought into the group homes was that institutional mindset. People's lives were still very controlled. They had very little say in what they did or who they did it with. They still often lived their lives only seeing other people with disabilities, except for the staff.
And it's not a normal rhythm. Everybody comes home at 3 or 3:30 from the day program and hangs out, and then at 5 or 5:30 it's time to eat, and then at 8 o'clock or 8:30 it's lights out, because those are the house rules.
As the community living model became regulated and standardized, an increasing number of people worked in each group home. A rotation of support staff also worked in the various daytime programs that occupied the vast majority of people with intellectual disabilities living in group homes.
I went from the group home to the sheltered workshop to the segregated recreational program, and so the round of life was still very much isolated in the human service system.
15 years later, small group homes, they got everything going for them, except they got institutional culture. Because it was started with institutional people all at once, they brought their culture, and there was no way of getting rid of it once it was established.
So it wasn't the buildings that were the problem, it was the programs around the people that were the problem. There's a big difference between being physically in a community and then being socially a part of the community.
As the challenges of creating non-institutional supports in the community became increasingly apparent, Wolfensberger focused on workshops designed to give students the tools they would need to best implement the principles and framework of normalization.
We take very, very complicated and very abstract topics and reformulate them in ways that I would say ordinary intelligent people can understand.
He was very skillful at engaging people.
He went out of his way to make sure that he was seeding the field with people who could then develop other leaders.
He literally had a small army of people around the country by the mid to late 1970s that were protégés of his views. everyone began questioning themselves. Now, what am I doing to suppose about what another person is capable of, whether they are an intellectually disabled person or not?
I was speechless during the entire workshop. In fact, they asked me if there was something wrong with me because I really was so taken that I could only sit and listen and soak it all in.
Wolf's passion was infectious. It fueled and it energized parents. It fueled, it energized agency leaders.
When you came to a Wolfensberger workshop, it was kind of like a juggernaut. You know, it was one thing after another.
Reflecting the man himself, equal parts scholar, change agent, and iconoclast, these workshops were intense.
And therefore we must also create the safeguards against the state, which is against ourselves.
One of Wolfensberger's more popular and more demanding workshops was Program Analysis of Service Systems, or PASS. This workshop provided a methodology for applying the principle of normalization and was used as a way to evaluate the quality of services people received.
He took an idea and then he said, here's the idea, and then here's the foundation it rests on, and then here are 17 ways that you can show how the idea takes place, and here are 21 examples of the idea done poorly, and all of a sudden it's, oh, you're beat over the head with it time after time, and eventually it sinks in.
From 8 o'clock in the morning or whenever we started until 2 or 3 or 4 the next morning, and that went on for 2 or 3 days.
I remember by the end of a weekend and then 5 days, I was totally exhausted. It was as though my brain had gone dry.
And he had a style of training that was almost like the SAS might get, you know, the Green Beret, where you put under duress, so let's not eat, let's not sleep, and then let's still win under those conditions.
We need to strip away your defensiveness. We have to allow your brain to see a different mental model than the one you are so used to seeing the world through.
And you will often be frustrated and exasperated with me when you ask me for the simple, easy solution. And I'll be endlessly telling you that there is none.
There are a lot of people just didn't buy it because there's a lot of in here you've got to sort of deal with as well as in here.
Wolf always said that for any of the people teaching this had to have really a personal commitment to serving people. It could not just become an academic endeavor.
The way the workshop went, there was this kind of very intensive lecturing, a rather complex theoretical construction of the principle of normalization broken out into 40-some dimensions. And then you went to visit a real service.
It was just a very effective teaching approach. So people aren't just hearing lectures and learning about the philosophy, but by virtue of going out and having to evaluate with both very structured checklists, people internalized that concept.
We take people into a human service or two, and they visit a residential service, they visit a day service, and they spend time with the people served.
You could begin to see how many different things were misaligned with the stated mission of a service program. So this group home is here to give people a great life and help them develop their potential and help them be part of the community and all that.
PASS showed that many service providers were not delivering on this promise.
It was a very emotional experience, and by the time you finished it, you had a better understanding of normalization, but you also had a better understanding of how, in a sense, all of us were, complicit in doing these things that really were contrary to normalization and against the best interests of people with disabilities.
What PASS and normalization gave us the opportunity to do in a very powerful way was to show all the ways that prejudice against people with disabilities kind of seeped in through the cracks and created a setting that defeated itself.
But the principle of normalization was only as good as the people who implemented it.
One of the things that Wolf taught me beyond the fundamental principles was a corollary, which I think happened to the principle of normalization, and that is that every good idea has within it the seeds of perversion. Every good idea has within it the seeds of perversion.
As the idea of normalization spread, its interpretation became distorted and its implementation oversimplified.
Normalization got perverted in this country. It got distorted because words got twisted. The institutional parents, the old guard parents, what do you mean, my kid's not normal and now you're telling me we're making them normal? That's not what the principle says, but that's how people heard it because they didn't want to deal with the real stuff.
States began writing normalization into the mandatory training requirements in institutions and group homes, codifying it into state law. But I also think that that meant that it got oversimplified, that it's impossible to do in state law what Wolf could do in a 6-day workshop, 18 hours a day, with 3 overhead projectors and 2 slide projectors and a bunch of willing disciples.
To counter the ineffective and counterproductive strategies that had been put in place in the name of normalization, Wolfensberger reformulated the concept with a focus on helping people develop valued social roles. He called his theory social role valorization.
Well, the advantage of that term was that nobody knew what it meant. So they had to start listening to an explanation.
Normalization was like a shotgun, multiple pellets, but you don't know which ones really make the difference. So what you look like, what you do, where you go, who you're with, and so on, and you just have to address all of that. Whereas SRV was able to target it. If you get the valued social role, everything else flows from that. So, now this is the thing that would really make the difference.
Edward Woolacott lives on his own in the town of Hawkesbury, Ontario. At age 8, he was sent to an institution where he stayed for 20 years. In a wave of deinstitutionalization, he moved into a 15-person group home and later a 6-person group home. He works as a furniture refinisher and receives a few hours of support each week in his home.
It's a surprising reversal of fortune, if you will. You know, after coming from a broken home, placed in an institution, at age 30, he started to live, and he started to be provided with opportunities for achieving those roles, those good things in life. I think what you'll find in Edward is a man who leads a very contented life. He's faced with some important challenges ahead of him, and the biggest challenge is retirement, giving up one of those roles. He's really not ready for it.
Wolfensberger challenged us to not just bring people into the community, but to support them to have the most highly valued roles.
You can do all these things, but unless the person gets a valued social role, then the observer is not going to interpret this person in a more valued way.
The move from normalization to social role valorization reflected Wolfensberger's deepening clarity of the power of social devaluation. He saw that efforts by many human services organizations to implement normalization had resulted in little change for people with disabilities. SRV was developed as an empirical, objective, scientific analysis of devaluation that would address the social and psychological wounds that are inflicted on vulnerable people.
If it was going to be validated, for him it was pretty apparent that this was in quotes true. But that the empirical research to do it, he would leave to others. That wasn't his job. He didn't have time for that.
And he worked so hard to organize it. And these distinctions are so important to him. And he's convinced that that will make a difference in the lives of people with disabilities. It's not just about Wolf. That if a cadre of people can understand these fine distinctions, that they will provide higher quality services. And they will train their trainees to make these fine distinctions. And for me, that level of nuance became less and less important. And so those were fighting words. Those were indications that you were leaving the fold.
While some of Wolfensberger's original students parted ways, others stayed and have remained committed to social role valorization.
We like snappy training. We like you go to a day and you learn how to be an expert on something. And when it comes to this kind of training, we've said quite the reverse. We've said it doesn't happen quickly, it happens slowly, it doesn't happen suddenly, it happens over a period of time. It's not like you can Google what you're supposed to do, okay? You have to figure it out, okay?
Some of Wolfensberger's early students took the principle of normalization in different directions, foregoing the complex empirical protocols of social role valorization for approaches that were more intuitive and accessible.
What I became aware of is that PASS was really good at helping us be critical and analyze what was wrong, but it was often difficult to see what could be better, how to be constructive. And so in a way, person-centered planning grew out of the ashes, if you will, of seeing how poorly we were actually doing around helping people really be members.
Person-centered planning is an approach designed to assist individuals plan their life and supports. The focus here is on an individual and that person's vision of what they would like to do in the future, rather than relying on support systems that may or may not be available to them.
You don't even hear the term normalization anymore. The phrase right now is person-centeredness, and in a sense, if you really look deep, the roots of person-centered services really lie in Wolf's normalization principles.
All these things are on a continuum, and they have the same underlying principles. You do it a person at a time, you figure out who they are and what they want and what they need, and then how to put those things together.
Despite the many students he had inspired to change the world of human services, Wolfensberger became increasingly pessimistic about the future.
Once you become observant and sophisticated in this kind of analysis, I mean, it's just amazing what you see and how you can reinterpret what is happening to the lives of the devalued people that you know of.
People didn't believe what he saw or predicted, but he was convinced that he was correct in the reading of the dynamics and that he had to speak to them. And all of that was just too controversial.
And you realize when there's a minor problem in their lives, that if that minor problem isn't quickly attended to, that it can mushroom or catapult into a lot of big problems and which can end up in death.
Talking about how good people, even good human service workers, can nonetheless contribute to the deaths of the people that they serve is probably his most powerful message. And it's his most unpopular message.
There's so many, many different ways of abbreviating devalued people's lives. The fact is that these deaths are the result of things not being done that could have been done to continue life.
He was considered a crackpot. He was considered just over the edge when he started talking about that.
Then people didn't want anything to do with him for that. And so they would cease sending their students to his classes.
Wolf had conviction, and it took him a while to formulate those convictions, and after he formulated them, he never questioned his stand.
While his ideas continued to influence the direction of human services, Wolfensberger's approach attracted fewer students and smaller audiences.
Wolfensberger was simply not a politician. Others would have taken a much easier road, I think, but for whatever reason, his sense of it was that we needed to be confronted on our failings relative to people with disabilities.
When you see things clearly the way they are, rather than the rosy way people want to see them, then obviously you get into conflict or controversy, and people don't want to hear what you see. Don't want to hear that. The indicators are that things will continue to get worse, dependency will increase, societal functionality will decrease, decadence is increasingly being celebrated as the new norm. Things have to get a lot worse, I think, before a lot of people will recover reality in our culture, particularly our so-called postmodernistic and constructionistic culture, where people get away with pretending that things are the way they wish they were.
You probably might not find a lot of hope there. I mean, because it was going to be a pretty severe critique of where you were and where things were at that point, but it was a voice that needed to be heard and reckoned with.
He was a truth teller, and that was a real badge of honor for him, and there could be no other way.
Wolf's understanding of human nature was also without parallel. He had a very good understanding of the capacity of human beings for good and evil.
Did he bring with him his childhood in Nazi Germany in looking at the future like that and reading signs of the times because the Germans didn't? Did he bring that with him to his work here? I can't imagine he didn't. I think he must have. He told the truth because he wanted the future to be better.
You had to admire Wolf because he did live by his conviction. And it wasn't always easy.
He didn't like being unpopular, as who does, but was prepared to make that sacrifice.
Any major change in the world was never accomplished by a rational strategic plan. It was accomplished by completely unreasonable people who dared to be bolder than everybody else.
Wolfensberger's legacy will be how he exposed and illuminated the patterns of societal devaluation and showed us that services supporting people with intellectual disabilities must use socially valued means to promote socially valued lives. And further, it will be what a generation of his students have and will continue to accomplish thanks to his hundreds of publications and workshops.
It has been the thing that has been, for me, tried and true, that really works, that's not easy to implement, but over the long haul, it is the thing that seems to make it most likely that people will have really good lives. And other things seem to come and go, but for me, these ideas have had power for years.
Wolf is one of the most influential figures of the 20th century. The world is a better place today because of Wolfensberger.
And so, who knows? Because the idea is universal, they may be called something else in 100 years, but the power of them will still be there, and hopefully they'll be, what we can do is to try to carry the ideas for a little while and hand them on to the next generation, and somebody else can pick them up.
Wolfensberger always intended his theories to apply to all devalued people, not just those with intellectual disabilities. Future applications for normalization could easily include child protection services, mental health, immigration, criminal justice, and supports for our aging population.
Disability is part of life. Some people are born with it, get it in early childhood, acquire it in adolescence or adulthood, and most of us, not all of us, if we live long enough, are going to experience some form of disability or disabilities.
What I'm discovering as an older woman is, and as a widow, there are a lot of me out there. And there are not the facilities, there are not the resources, so these women end up in nursing homes.
After all, how many people at all do you know who say, I'd really like to end my life in a nursing home?
I feel like it's a really important time in our field to revive the ideas related to normalization. I think we often miss the mark. We're just trying to help people have a job, and food service is okay, or janitorial work, and it's okay if people are doing things in groups of 10 and 12. And if we don't have the lens of normalization, we don't have the ability to analyze that situation and see how it actually hurts more than it helps.
Mark Twain said that history may not repeat itself, but it often rhymes. New segregated communities are being developed by those who believe their children with disabilities will be happier and safer with their own kind. As we learned from over a century of institutionalizing people with disabilities, a practice that began with noble intentions, people live healthier, happier, and more productive lives within our communities. But this is an argument a new generation of advocates will need to make for seniors, those with disabilities, and others who are devalued in society.
If we can inculcate the normalization principles and normalization thinking toward our fellow man, whether it be an individual with an intellectual disability or not, perhaps we won't have to pay quite so many service providers to provide those services.
There are still people being institutionalized. We thought we dealt with that. There are still people being sterilized. We thought we dealt with that. We thought that protection and advocacy and ethics committees and human subjects committees were keeping those things from happening. And once you understand that with Wolfensberger in the back of your head, it's not just one unfortunate case. It's a question of, are we losing the ground that we thought we had made?
We need people like Wolf. We needed him then, and we need people like Wolf now to pull the veil away. We also need people to help steer us back on course.